of today, 27 CPS students have been killed. As of today, 229 CPS students have been shot. That's not even counting alternative schools, dropouts. That's only Chicago public school students, because nobody's counting the other numbers. Every mother or father out here who's lost a child, raise your hand. Every person out here who's a family member or a friend who has been shot or killed, lift your hand. It's called insanity.
The surest way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Antonio Goss, Joel Batener, Michael Pierce, Christopher Travis, William Latrell, Darnell Choice, Jawan Brooks, Andrew Powell, Michael Frazier.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Juju Chang. I want to share with you three very simple, very somber statistics to begin our discussion. Number one, you saw it in the film, 300,000 guns are in America at this moment. And homicide is now the leading cause of death for young African American men. And in fact, guns are now more deadly to Americans between the age of 15 and 24 than car crashes. I'm going to let that sink in for a moment. There are just a few of the statistics that shock us to the core, and they describe the relentless bloodshed that's caused by guns in our countries, in our communities, in our towns. I'm joined on stage tonight by four women who are so eager to share their story with you. 3 out of 4 of these women on stage, I hate to say it, were catapulted onto the stage as activists for the worst reason. They lost children to gun violence. They are here to share intimate and painful insights into the devastation that guns can cause. To my right is Sandy Phillips. Her daughter Jessie was gunned down in the mass killing that took place at a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. Back in 2012, Sandy is now devoted full-time to campaigning for tighter gun legislation. And I'll tell you, as the gunfire went off, I heard Sandy say, "I hate to hear that sound." Kim Oden is next to her. She's from Boston. Her 14-year-old son, Stephen, was shot dead in 2007. She later co-founded Operation Lipstick, a community organization that tackles gun trafficking and straw buying. And for those of you who don't know what straw purchases are, we'll get to that in a moment. Kim's son was playing basketball in the front yard when it happened. Dorothy Johnson-Speight is to her right. She's the founder of Mothers in Charge, a violence prevention organization she founded in her hometown of Philadelphia after her son, Khalik, was murdered in 2001. And Kim Fox is to her right. She is the Democratic nominee for Cook County State's Attorney. She's in the midst of a general election campaign. She grew up on the south side of Chicago, where, according to the latest figures, gun violence is up 84% in the first months of this year. We're going to break this down into a couple of different themes. We're going to start with the idea of access to guns. And Sandy, I want to start with you. What happened to Jessie? Tell us about it, and also tell us about the trail that the gun took to that movie theater.
Happy to. Jessie went to the movie with her best guy friend that evening. It was his last night in town, and she couldn't get into, when she went online, she couldn't get any tickets. They were sold out. But she was very tenacious, and she kept trying, and she was able to secure tickets to the 12:05 showing, which unfortunately put them into Theater 9 instead of Theater 8. When the gunman came in and started firing, she was hit first in her leg, in her thigh, and it went through into the other thigh. But Brent didn't know it. The young man that was with her was a paramedic, but he immediately started to try to compress the wound. What he didn't know, and we didn't find out until a few weeks later, was that she had been shot 6 times with a .223, which is military-grade ammunition, steel-tipped, that is designed to do the most damage not only to the body, but to cars, walls, steel.
Armor-piercing bullets.
Basically, yes. And he was able to amass 4,000 rounds of ammunition with a click of a mouse. So he didn't have to provide any ID. He didn't have to go through a background check. So that means that anyone in our country or anyone visiting can do the same thing.
I read an article about you, Sandy, and the headline was, "We lost our daughter to a mass shooter and now owe $203,000 to his ammo dealer."
Yes.
Explain that headline.
Well, we sued the manufacturer, not for money, but we sued to have them change their business practices. We wanted them to start providing background checks, or at least, at the very minimum, say, give me your ID, prove to me that you are who you say you are, and that this ammo is going to the same address that your billing address. And they didn't want to do that because of PLACA. They don't have to do that. So,
and PLACA, just so we know, is Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms?
Yeah, it sounds like a great law, but it's not. And it actually protects gun manufacturers and ammo dealers and tear gas dealers and all of that. So the judge on the first motion dismissed the case and left us with originally $264,000, but he was kind enough to reduce it to $203,000.
And you had to pay the ammo company.
Well, we haven't, and we won't.
Right. Dorothy, I want to ask you about your son, Khalid. Tell us what happened. Tell us how the gun that killed him was purchased illegally.
Sure. Khalid was my firstborn, my only son. He was 24 years old, and he was shot to death over a parking space. He was shot 7 times by someone who had actually murdered someone else 5 months before he murdered Khalid. The gun was purchased by the girlfriend of the person who murdered Khalid, and that was the testimony at trial. There was a dispute over a parking space. This very angry, out of control person, very, very angry, shot and killed him. That was not the first time that I had to bury a child. My daughter, Carlina, was 2.5 years old and she died of bacterial meningitis. But as I was sharing earlier, there's no right way to lose a child. It's painful for a parent, no matter the circumstances. But when someone deliberately takes someone's life, there's so many things that complicate your grief, as these mothers know. You have to deal with the criminal justice system, the police, and so many aspects of your grief, and that journey is so difficult because someone made a conscious decision to take someone's life, take your loved one's life.
You know, Dorothy, I want to bring the idea of the role of women into this, so I want to bring Kim Oden into this. The idea that the illegal gun was purchased by a woman is the idea of a straw purchase. Tell me about Lipstick and what that organization aims to do in terms of women buying guns illegally.
Sure. First, I'd just like to say a little bit about my son, Stephen. So Stephen was 13 years old, and he was actually walking home from playing basketball in the neighborhood with friends. And as Sandy talked about the gunshots, hearing those gunshots, we heard the gunshots as well as he was outside of our home. And, you know, when that happened to Stephen, the question was, who did it? I want to know who did it and why. But I also learned, because I could not accept that Stephen's life ended on that sidewalk and that his death would be in vain. And so I learned also another important question to ask was, where did that gun come from that ended up in the hand of what we would learn a 17-year-old? And I went on a quest to be a part of those trying to find solutions. And I went to an event where this person was holding an event that spoke to the public health issue of gun violence and women being involved in it. And there was a woman giving her testimony in front of the Congress about how she did a straw purchase, and she purchased 40 guns. And out of that, that testimony that this woman gave evolved the work of Lipstick. Lipstick stands for Ladies Involved in Putting a Stop to Inner City Killing, because we realize that just as women are easy prey in terms of just as the way that they are exploited in drug trafficking and sex trafficking, they are also exploited in gun trafficking.
Which is why a gun bought illegally by a woman is twice as likely to be involved in a homicide.
Yes.
Kim Fox, I want to bring you in. As a prosecutor, tell me how you focus on the idea of illegal trafficking.
So one of the sad realities in the city of Chicago, where Cook County is located, is that we deal with gun violence in the aftermath, after someone has been murdered, after a crime has been committed. The issue of trafficking is one that in Cook County we've not targeted in a meaningful way that we should. We should not have to wait to meet another victim, to meet another mother. In the city of Chicago alone, just last year, in 2015, there were only 3 arrests for straw purchasing, just 3. And there's a reality that we know that over the border in Indiana, there's a large number of the guns that are that are obtained from gun shops in Indiana that are sold in the market in Cook County that are used in a number of homicides. And what we need to do is not just wait for the gun to then be used, we have to be more strategic and targeted in dealing with trafficking. And that means working with partners in the ATF, as well as the U.S. Attorney's Office and federal laws to deal with that. But truly, the focus has been in law enforcement in aftermath, after the bloodbath, after blood has been spilled. And at that point, it's far too late.
The other theme that we wanted to try to touch on is this idea of cycles of violence and how it sort of, permeates the culture. We're talking about young boys who are traumatized. Tell us about how you're using that as a way of trying to do prevention.
Well, one of the saddest cases that came out of 2015, out of many in Cook County in Chicago, was a 9-year-old boy who was sitting on a swing and was lured into an alley and shot in the head. This was a 9-year-old boy who was literally executed. And the reality of that is that the next day, that 4th grade classroom would see an empty seat where this 9-year-old will no longer sit. And the trauma for the other kids who are there is not met. And they truly believe that they also need to be armed because they saw one of their classmates get executed. And the unfortunate reality in Chicago and across this country is that it's easier to get accessibility to a gun than it is to get accessibility to mental health treatment to deal with the trauma that these children are experiencing. We have one high school in Chicago alone that had 6 homicides by gun violence this school year alone. And so that permeates a cycle of trauma unmet and the need to feel that they're protecting themselves and the easy accessibility of firearms.
Dorothy,
I think,
go ahead.
You were talking about the cycle and the hospitals, and you talk to public health and safety specialists, and they will tell you that they have young children coming into the hospitals at a rate with PTSD that is so staggering, and they're the same PTSD symptoms, thank you, as they're seeing in people returning from the war.
Sure.
So to say that we're not at war in our own country over this issue is putting blinders on.
Dorothy, I know that Mothers in Charge deals with a lot of these kinds of social, emotional treatments.
yeah, our city is one that is now on target to, we call it trauma-informed care, because of so many communities, across this country actually that are experiencing, as you stated, the trauma and, all that goes with that. We've oftentimes thought about trauma or post-traumatic stress, as you mentioned, with the war and men and women coming back from the war, but in these communities, they can't come back. I mean, they're there. They're there every single day of their lives. They can't escape it, is what I'm saying. So they're living in trauma situations all the time, and no one's caring for them.
And I know that you want to try to help reframe the discussion as a national public policy debate.
Absolutely, it is that. It's the leading cause of death among African American males 14 to 34. So it's the leading cause of death. It's not some incurable disease, it's homicide.
It's a public health crisis.
It's a public health crisis. So when you think about a public health crisis, you think about diseases like Ebola and things like that, and all the federal dollars that go into stopping the spread of such diseases. But homicide is the leading cause of death, is a very serious public health epidemic, and needs to be treated that way.
Right.
It needs to be treated as a public health epidemic.
And, you know, as we're all talking, Dorothy, as what Dorothy just said, the two of the young men that were involved in Stephen's murder, the one who was accused of being as the shooter, he was murdered 10 days after my son, but the one who gave him the gun, the young man who gave the gun to his friend, he was sentenced 6 to 8 years in prison, but he tells you know, I learned that he was at the age of 14, he got shot himself. And we'll talk a little bit about this.
Well, and you decided to go visit with him as part of the Victim Offender Dialogue Program.
I had a victim offender dialogue with this young man. As I said, there's so many layers to what's happening, and just as important what the work of lipstick is in addressing, you know, that behavior and how women are exploited to do that, and it was important to get involved and do the community work in churches and schools and all kinds of places to raise that awareness. It was also important for me to talk to this young man. I had questions. I wanted to know why. But even beyond that, just having that up close and, you know, I need to talk to this young man about what happened that night. And even to find out, have you changed? Has anything changed, you know? Are you still in that mentality? And
Sandy, I'm curious, before we marched out, you said this is a fierce band of mothers who have a lot to say. You know, you talked about being galvanized, looking at the gun lobby in Washington. Your journey has been profiled in Under the Gun, which is a movie that is out in the Sundance Festival. Katie Couric's involved in it. Tell me a little bit about your political journey, and also about sort of where the pressure points are in the gun lobby.
Whew. Well, first of all, there are 300 million guns out in America. So the horse has left the barn. So when we hear politicians say, oh, everybody needs to be armed, which is crazy. We have politicians that say, oh, we need a ban on assault rifles. That's not going to happen. It's not practical. But we can put laws into place and tighten laws that exist so we don't have the loopholes that we currently have. Certainly passing expanded background checks on every single gun sold in America.
And we're talking about federal laws. You
Federal.
can applaud if you feel like it. You want to talk about federal laws because if different states have different laws, there's an iron pipeline.
There is, from Florida, who has very weak laws, in Georgia, right up the whole East Coast, all the way into Toronto. For Chicago, you've got them coming in from Indiana. You actually have college students who are buying guns and selling them so they can pay off their tuition. This is what we've created in America. And without the expanded background checks, to dry up the supply, literally, because if you can't qualify to get a gun, then it's going to be harder to buy a gun. And changing the loopholes on the internet and being able to buy guns on Facebook and Craigslist and all these other, in the back of a truck. Until we start tightening those up, we're destined to repeat ourselves.
And I'd like to add, I met Kim through lipstick, and I think oftentimes women don't realize, or maybe they realize it, but because of, the association with that person in their life, that guy in their life, that they will go into a store and purchase a gun for their boyfriend. That was the situation with my son's, the gun that killed my son. The girlfriend had purchased it, but she had been a victim of abuse by him. There were many calls, I understand, I found out later, there were many calls of domestic violence to the home where they shared.
Well, Kim, I want you to jump in on this too, because there really is a link between these female straw purchases and domestic violence.
Yes.
Well, I really appreciate Dorothy, sharing that and the fact that in her situation that happened, it speaks to, the importance of us, addressing that intersection of what's happening in domestic violence. And as I said earlier, women are easy prey. Women are easy prey. Just
they get coerced.
Yes.
They get intimidated.
Yes. But the good thing about what lipstick has done has, in a sense, opened up Pandora's box, I guess you could say, or addressed the elephant in the room. And in Boston, what we now know is that a third of the firearms crimes by women has decreased in Boston, and that's credited to lipstick.
I just want to draw people's attention to the PSA that's above us. That is His Crime, Your Time. This is part of the domestic violence linked straw purchase PSAs to raise that awareness. Kim Fox, I want to bring you in. This idea of anger management and gun violence. It seems like a non sequitur, and yet you're saying that you see social media as a flashpoint in a lot of this.
Absolutely. There's this notion that a lot of the gun violence that we see in urban areas is directly related to gangs, and there's certainly an issue related to gangs, but what we're finding is that gun offenders are becoming younger and younger, and the social media space has allowed for a conversation and conflict to arise, where someone feels insulted over something that was said over social media, and
conversational conflict. That's a nice way of saying trash talking.
Trash talking.
Yeah.
Where, back in the day, you just, delete someone, or you meet up and there would be an argument. What we see is these arguments that take place online, people meet up in public, and what was once resolved either by talking or fisticuffs, as we used to say back in my day, are now being resolved by firearms. We have a case in Chicago right now that's pending where two girls were fighting over Facebook. They met up for a fight, and someone came with a gun and gave a gun to a 14-year-old who ended up executing another 14-year-old. And so what we need to start worrying about and focusing our attention, in addition to the gun laws, trafficking, and in the aftermath, is how do we slow the process down when conflict arises? Now that we know that the accessibility of guns is a factor, how do we get young people to slow their movement? And there's a lot of research that's being done. The University of Chicago is doing a lot of research on how do we get that to happen? Because if we have a chance to have them think beyond that moment, because once the trigger is pulled, once the bullet is shot, it's over. And they don't see beyond that. So anger management, conflict resolution, these aren't touchy-feely, notions of how to combat violent crime. They're an absolutely necessary component.
And can I add to that as well? You're talking about we attribute it all to gang violence, and that's kind of a touchy subject to me, because when Stephen was murdered, my mom tells a story that the night that he was murdered, police officer leans over and whispers in her ear, was he in a gang? And Stephen wasn't in a gang. But however, there was the people that involved in it were, and this young man, when he said he was shot at 14, he told me the story that he wasn't in a gang at the time, but he was introduced. And he was introduced, someone introduced the gun to him, that he could go and take care of the situation with a gun. And then it just seemed that trajectory just seemed to spiral, and again, it's such a public health crisis, and we really do have to address it as such.
And I think oftentimes we think that young people know how to handle their anger, but they don't. You know, and these are tools that they need to learn oftentimes. And with the availability of guns, that's what makes it so deadly. We have a lot of the work that Mothers in Charge does, in addition to providing support to families who've lost loved ones, we have prevention and intervention programs. And anger management we do twice a week at Mothers in Charge is one of the things that we do. And you think that people just know not to pick up a gun. But you take someone who maybe that's been their frame of reference. They've lived that, they've seen it in their homes and in their communities. They see that that's how anger is handled, with a violent confrontation. So that's what they grow up understanding and doing. And unless they're giving tools or giving ideas of ways to handle their conflict and their anger, that's what they do. And so it's important that they get those tools to make better decisions and handle their situations in different ways.
There are a lot of powerful women in this audience, and some men too, I'm sure. And I know they all want to know these solutions, how to plug in. I mean, I know you were inspired by Mothers Against Drunk Driving as a way of sort of galvanizing, moms and the passion that we have. From a political landscape, from these therapeutic models, how can people get involved and do things?
Well, there's lots of ways, but I want to backtrack for just a moment. We were talking about anger management. The young man that killed the 12 in the theater had told his therapist that all he wanted to do was kill people, and she did not report that. Also, he brags to this day that he chose a mass shooting because it was so easy to get the gun. So that's what we all live with, is the ease of being able to get the gun. But what we didn't know, my husband and I being gun owners, we thought that there were laws in place. And we drank the pablum, so to speak, of the NRA, even though we were not members of the NRA. But we found out all these loopholes that exist, and we found out that what we had believed was false. So we're on a quest to educate America and let you know what you don't know. And that's why we're all here, and that's why we're all involved. And you can be involved at the grassroots level anywhere you live.
And each of you have turned your pain and your anger into action.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think it's important. And I think it's important that everyone here understands that whether you're directly or indirectly affected, you are affected by violence that happens in every community across this country. And there's many ways that you can get involved, and you should.
And that should be sustained. We shouldn't wait for the next headline, for the next mass shooting, or to look at the numbers rise in Chicago. The anger that we feel about the loss of life, the loss of young life at the hands of easily we talk about public health. Prevention is one of the things that you deal with when you are dealing with public health crisis. We can prevent a lot of this senseless death by investing in, prevention services, whether it's trauma-informed services, whether it's anger management, therapeutic counseling. But we have to sustain the anger about what's happened to our country, that if we can have a homicide occur every 37 minutes in this country, and we are not outraged every single day, that is a problem.
And it has to be both prevention and intervention, where we're getting to the hearts and minds of our young people and through families, because I often say this is happening on an adult watch. Like, this stuff that's happening are learned behaviors. We don't bring our children into the world to be murderers and and all this negativity. So it's prevention and it's intervention. And then we can't throw them away. When young people mess up, and sometimes mess up in a very horrific way. This young man didn't pull the trigger, but he helped provide that gun. Perhaps if he hadn't, Stephen would still be here. But I'm concerned about him coming back into a society that, in a sense, wants to throw him away, call him an animal, and all of that. He's got to be able to have a second chance so that we break the cycle. We have to heal. There's a healing that has to begin on both sides.
And the number one way that everyone in this audience can make a difference is to vote in every single election.